They say it comes with the cold. When the snow falls and the rivers freeze, when the meat runs out and hunger gnaws like a beast in the belly, then the Wendigo stirs. It is not just a monster. It is a hunger made flesh, a spirit of winter famine and desperation, a curse as old as the trees and as wide as the northern wind. But what is the Wendigo really? To most, it is little more than a cryptid, a mythical creature, half-man, half-beast, skulking through snowy woods with antlers and an insatiable appetite. It appears in horror films, video games, Halloween costumes. Its name is whispered in campfire tales as a warning or a thrill. Yet few know where that name comes from. Fewer still know what it meant, and almost no one remembers why it was once truly feared. This story is not about a monster in the woods. This is the story of a belief, a warning passed from one generation to the next. This is the story of a moral code, enforced not by laws, but by spirits. This is the story of how the Wendigo became the most terrifying creature in North America, not because it stalked the forest, but because it lived inside us. And it begins long before Europeans set foot on this continent. Among the Algonquian-speaking peoples, nations like the Ojibwe, Cree, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Saulteaux, the Wendigo is not merely a legend. It is a force, a presence, a spiritual warning woven deep into the fabric of life, especially in the harsh northern winters. To understand the Wendigo, you must understand what it guarded against. In the old stories, the Wendigo is not simply a cannibal. It is what happens when the hunger overtakes the person, when survival crosses a line into desecration, when self-preservation becomes so extreme, so selfish, so desecrating, that it ruptures the order of the world. In a land where resources were scarce, where survival required communal care, where generosity was not virtue but necessity, the Wendigo was the antithesis of harmony. It represented greed, hoarding, isolation, the refusal to share even when others starved. It was not a myth to scare children, it was a warning to adults. A reminder that survival without morality was not survival, it was possession. The Wendigo is what you became when you chose yourself over the tribe, when you devoured rather than endured, when you consumed more than you needed, even if it meant another died. And it always began the same way. Hunger, a long winter, a lost hunting party, a man alone in the woods, a family snowed in. The line between need and desire starts to blur. Something ancient whispers in the cold. A deal is made not aloud, but in the marrow, and when spring comes, the others are gone, and something with human eyes remains. This is what the elders feared. Not the creature with antlers and claws, but the man, who had become something else. Something no longer bound by kinship. Something with a hunger that grew even after the stomach was full. Because the Wendigo is not just the act of cannibalism, it is the transformation that follows. In many stories, the Wendigo grows in size the more it eats, but is never full. Its body stretches, its skin cracks, its voice becomes wind, its limbs become branches. It is no longer recognizable. It is monstrous precisely because it began as human. And this is what makes the Wendigo different from other monsters. It is not foreign. It is not born evil. It is made by circumstance, by choice, by surrender. It is a mirror held up in the snow, a reflection of what we become when desperation outweighs dignity. But there is more. Because the Wendigo was not just a warning. It was a spirit. It moved through the forest, yes, but also through minds, through dreams. It could possess. It could whisper. It could turn someone long before a single bite was taken. And so there were rules, rituals, ceremonies. The elders knew what to look for. Sudden violence, irrational greed, a look in the eye that was no longer quite human. Sometimes they acted fast, restraining the afflicted. Sometimes they waited too long. And sometimes the cure was fatal. There are documented cases, many from the 17th through 19th centuries, of accused Wendigo being killed by their own communities. Men who had killed, or had thought about killing, or who simply behaved in a way that felt wrong. European colonists called these murders, but to the people involved they were necessary. Exorcisms by axe and fire, judgment in a world where spirits were as real as snow. And this brings us to a truth far stranger than myth, because even in colonial court records the Wendigo appears. Not just in stories, but in crimes, real trials, real executions, real panic. Anthropologists and missionaries documented it. Colonial officials were baffled by it. Doctors gave it a name, Wendigo psychosis. They saw it as madness, a delusion, a mental illness of starvation and isolation. But the people who lived it, they saw something else, a spiritual disease, a haunting, a possession that blurred the line between hunger and horror, body and soul. And while psychologists debated diagnoses, shamans and elders continued their rites, burning herbs, offering songs, whispering prayers in languages older than ink. Because even if the white man did not believe in the Wendigo, the snow still came, and people still disappeared. This is where our journey begins. Not with monsters, but with memory, with the story of a spirit that survives in shadow, adapted, misunderstood, commodified, but never quite forgotten. A spirit born from hunger and preserved by story. A being that reflects more than it reveals. Because the Wendigo is not just a legend of the past. It is a lesson, a question, a warning, and in the long winter ahead, it may yet speak again. To speak of the Wendigo is not simply to speak of a creature, it is to speak of a spiritual force. And in the world of the first peoples of North America, spirit is not metaphor, it is reality. Among the Algonquian-speaking nations, the world is not divided into natural and supernatural material and immaterial. Everything has spirit. Every rock, tree, animal, river, each carries its own energy, its own presence. And among these forces, some guide, some protect, and some warn. The Wendigo was one such force, not a monster in the woods, but a spirit that lingered in the cracks of human morality. It was called many names across regions, Widico, Windikokan, Widiko-Chinu, but the essence remained. The Wendigo was the embodiment of imbalance, of taking too much, of breaking the cycle. Because balance to the indigenous worldview is not preference, it is survival, hunting only what you need, sharing in times of famine, honoring the animals that gave their lives. These were not cultural quirks, they were sacred obligations. The Wendigo punished their violation. When someone refused to share, the Wendigo stirred. When someone hoarded during a famine, the Wendigo watched. When someone fed themselves at the expense of another's life, the Wendigo whispered. And in time it did more than whisper. It entered them. Wendigo possession was not just myth, it was feared reality. Elders and medicine people knew the signs. A change in appetite, cold detachment, sudden outbursts of violence, nightmares filled with howling winds and bones. Sometimes the afflicted would speak of voices. Others would wander into the forest and return with empty eyes. In these communities, healing was spiritual before it was physical. Shamans known by many names, Midawiwin, Nawaidikichi Ayakweo, would perform rituals to cleanse the spirit. Offerings were made, herbs burned, stories told, sacred songs sung through generations. But not every case could be cured. Some were too far gone. And when that happened, when the hunger had fully replaced the soul, a hard decision followed. A Wendigo could not be allowed to live among the people. There are oral histories chilling clear of entire villages gathering to stop an afflicted person. Sometimes with compassion, sometimes with violence, always with grief. This was not justice, it was protection. And unlike in modern criminal courts, guilt here was not about action alone, but spirit. A man could be stopped, not for what he had done, but for what he had become. Colonial observers would later call these executions savage. But they missed the deeper truth. To the people of these lands, the Wendigo was not an external monster. It was what happened when the sacred laws were broken. And that sacredness extended even to language. You did not speak its name lightly. You did not tell its stories out of season. You did not draw its image casually. Even to talk about the Wendigo was to risk inviting it. And yet the stories persisted, because they served as moral compass, as psychological map, as spiritual boundary. Children were told the tales not to terrify but to warn. There is a line inside you, and if you cross it, you may not return. One of the most haunting beliefs was that the Wendigo spirit could pass from person to person, not through bite or blood, but through envy, through jealousy, through the refusal to see others as kin. It spread through the soul, not the skin. And in this way, the Wendigo became not just a story for the woods, but for the village, for the heart. It taught you that the real danger is not outside. It is the moment you forget you belong to others. In winter, this truth sharpened. When food was scarce and hunger real, when the snows buried game trails and the cold seeped into the bones, the Wendigo hovered close. But so too did the spirits of ancestors, of animals, of medicine. Balance had to be fought for. And stories were one of the weapons. Every retelling, every ritual, every whispered warning was not just survival. It was resistance. A way to remember the sacred when the body forgot. This is why the Wendigo cannot be understood outside its cultural roots. It is not a cryptid, not a demon, not a Halloween costume. It is a sacred story born of snow and suffering. And like all sacred stories, it was never static. Different nations had different forms. Some saw it as a tall, skeletal beast. Others as a spirit cloud. Some saw no physical form at all, only symptoms. All agreed, however, on the hunger, the endlessness, the desecration of kinship. And yet there was always hope. Even when the Wendigo appeared, even when someone fell to its grasp, there remained the possibility of healing, of ceremony, of song. Because unlike modern monsters, the Wendigo was not simply evil. It was the warning beneath the skin. It was a guide cloaked in terror pointing back to the sacred path. In the next part, we will explore how colonial contact altered the Wendigo myth, how Christian missionaries and European settlers misunderstood, reshaped, and even weaponized the concept. How the Wendigo became a tool of fear in two cultures, but for different reasons. For now, remember, the Wendigo is not waiting in the woods. It is waiting in choice, in hunger, in forgetting who you are to others, and sometimes in the cold silence of a long winter night. It whispers. The Wendigo had long haunted the forests of the north, but it was not until outsiders arrived that it began to change. When European missionaries, fur traders, and colonial governors first entered the lands of the Algonquian peoples, they came with their own beliefs, their own gods, their own fears, and above all, their own need to understand or to control what they encountered. And what they encountered was something they could not name. They heard stories of a spirit that possessed the greedy, a force that fed on the selfish, a being that grew stronger the more it consumed. It was alien to them, too spiritual to be dismissed, too frightening to be ignored. And so they gave it a new name, demon. From the Christian lens, the Wendigo was quickly interpreted as a devil, a tempter, a sign of pagan corruption. The nuanced spiritual figure that once acted as moral compass and boundary keeper was reduced to a creature of sin and evil. But this was not just a mistranslation. It was a strategy. By redefining the Wendigo as evil, incarnate missionaries hoped to make indigenous belief systems incompatible with Christian salvation. The shaman was now a sorcerer. The cleansing ritual became witchcraft. The spirit story became heresy. And in doing so, they severed the story from its roots. The Wendigo became a tool of fear, but not indigenous fear, colonial fear. Fear of the wild, fear of the unknowable, fear of people who could not be easily controlled. It is no accident that the first written accounts of the Wendigo in European texts describe it as grotesque, horned, fang-twisted, a cannibal with hooves and yellow eyes, a beast worthy of exorcism. But these were not images drawn from Algonquian memory. They were projections, reflections of Christian demonology, mapped onto a spirit that had once been part of the natural, moral, and communal world. And the consequences were immediate. Shamans were persecuted. Ceremonies were banned. Speaking of the Wendigo became dangerous, not because of the spirit itself, but because of how the colonizers had defined it. And yet the Wendigo did not disappear. It adapted. It entered colonial records, not as folklore, but as crime. In 1878 in Ontario, a Cree man named Swift Runner was tried and executed for cannibalism. He had killed and eaten his family during a harsh winter, but he claimed it was not he who did it, but the Wendigo inside him. The court saw madness. His people saw possession. The trial became infamous. Swift Runner was hung by colonial authorities, but the spirit that had haunted him was not so easily removed. And he was not the only one. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were other cases. Men believed to be possessed. Killings carried out in the name of protection. Trials that baffled colonial judges but made perfect sense to the communities involved. Even psychologists began to take note. They coined a term, Wendigo psychosis, a culture-bound syndrome, they said. A delusion specific to native populations, marked by the intense desire to eat human flesh, even when other food was available. It was studied, diagnosed, pathologized, but in naming it, they missed it. Because Wendigo psychosis was never a disease. It was a symbol, a way of expressing something deeper, the terror of losing oneself, the horror of breaking community bonds, the fear of becoming something inhuman, not in body, but in spirit. But to the colonial world, spirit was not real. Only madness could explain it. And so the Wendigo, once a sacred story of moral boundaries, became a case study. A cautionary tale not about greed, but about primitive superstition. Its spiritual depth erased. Its cultural context flattened. Its warning silenced beneath the weight of reason. But spirits do not die from reason. They retreat. And sometimes they wait. Because even in the face of colonization, the Wendigo did not vanish. It survived in whispers, in hidden stories, in songs sung softly under breath, and in the long, harsh winters, when the meat was gone, and the wind howled just right, it was still there, watching. The real horror was not that the Wendigo changed. It was that it was changed for others' purposes, used as a tool of domination, a justification for religious conversion, a case study to advance Western psychiatry, a monster stripped of meaning and sold back to the world as entertainment. In the next part, we will examine how this transformation continued into the 20th and 21st centuries, how the Wendigo became a horror icon in pop culture, twisted further from its sacred roots, and turned into a mask that barely resembled what it once was. But for now, let us sit with this moment in history, the moment when a story was taken, when a spirit was redefined, when a warning turned into a weapon. And remember, to change the meaning of a monster is to change the mirror it holds. And sometimes, that mirror reflects the colonizer more than the creature. The Wendigo once lived in ritual fire and silence. Now it lives in pixels, on television screens, in video games, in comics, and collectibles. It snarls from the shadows of horror movies, hunts teenagers in snow-covered cabins, shrieks in streaming trailers. Its name is known more widely now than ever before, but its meaning is barely recognizable. Because the Wendigo has been devoured by pop culture. It began slowly. In the early 20th century, American and Canadian authors, many unfamiliar with or dismissive of Indigenous traditions, began inserting the Wendigo into their tales. Algernon, Blackwood's 1910 short story, The Wendigo, was one of the first. A chilling tale set in the Canadian wilderness, it describes a malevolent, invisible force that stalks and maddens hunters. But even then the transformation had begun. Blackwood's Wendigo was not a moral force, not a spiritual warning. It was a monster, amorphous, alien, unnatural. The roots of the story were acknowledged, but only in passing. The culture was background, the fear was foreground. Over the decades, the trend continued. Horror novels reimagined the Wendigo as a beast of the woods, something between werewolf and ghost. Filmmakers exaggerated its features: long claws, antlers like twisted trees, glowing eyes, decaying flesh. The subtleties of the original myth were shed like a too heavy coat. In place of a moral symbol, we got a marketable monster. It was not malicious at first, just careless. Artists and storytellers captivated by the atmosphere of the myth borrowed its aesthetics while discarding its ethics. The Wendigo became aestheticized horror, usable, flexible, profitable. But the carelessness became distortion. And the distortion became violence, because the Wendigo is not a monster of universal design. It is a sacred teaching of specific peoples, a story with roots in land, language, and law. And when those roots are severed, when the Wendigo is printed on t-shirts or turned into a Halloween decoration, it is not just a myth that is misunderstood. It is a culture that is erased. Native communities have spoken out. Elders have explained time and again that the Wendigo is not for entertainment, that the stories were told with purpose, that they were and are part of a living spiritual worldview, not horror fiction. But the industry rarely listens, because horror sells, especially horror that exoticizes indigenous belief. The Wendigo, in its modern form, fits neatly into the Western horror formula: isolated wilderness, irrational hunger, monstrous transformation. It echoes zombie lore, vampire myth, lycanthropic fear. But it does so by overriding what made it unique: its role as moral compass, its context within community, its anchoring in reciprocity and restraint. And so the Wendigo becomes yet another flattened figure, another monster in the menagerie, a thing to kill in a video game, a scare to trigger jump cuts in a Netflix thriller, a name to whisper for viral creepypasta. But something is lost in the process. Not just accuracy, but reverence. Because the Wendigo was never meant to amuse. It was meant to instruct, to hold up a mirror to human greed, to remind us of the thin line between survival and surrender, to teach us what happens when we forget our obligations to others. When that mirror is cracked, turned into spectacle, rather than warning, it reflects nothing. And yet the story persists. Even distorted, the Wendigo lingers in cultural imagination, perhaps because something in it still rings true. We are, after all, in a time of consumption, of endless appetite, of growth without end, of profit over people, resource over reciprocity, speed over stillness. And somewhere deep in that frenzy, the Wendigo watches. Its true form forgotten, its sacredness stripped, but its warning still echoing. Some indigenous creators have begun reclaiming the story. In books, films, and digital art, they are telling the tale again on their terms. They are restoring nuance, restoring spirit, reminding audiences that the Wendigo is not a creature to kill, but a question to consider. They are asking, what makes a person a monster? What happens when we take more than we need? What are we becoming? These are the real horrors. Not fangs and antlers, but choices, habits, systems that consume and consume and consume and are never full. We are, some say, in a Wendigo world, and that truth is more terrifying than any Hollywood jump scare. In the next part, we will step deeper into the philosophical core of the Wendigo myth. What does it mean to be consumed from the inside out? How does the myth serve as an ecological and psychological metaphor for the modern world? But for now, let's sit in the dark theater of culture. Let's watch the screen flicker. And let's ask, when the monster grins back at us, are we sure it isn't just wearing our face? The Wendigo is more than a monster. It is a metaphor. A story woven not only from snow and starvation, but from the deeper hungers that haunt us still. Because the Wendigo myth did not survive for centuries by being static. It evolved, it adapted, and in doing so it began to reveal something terrifyingly modern: the sickness of endless consumption. Not just of food, but of resources, of people, of meaning. In the original teachings, the Wendigo punished those who took more than their share, those who hoarded in times of need, who devoured others to survive, even when other paths remained. The horror was not just the act of consumption, it was what it revealed: the collapse of community. Now look around. We live in an age of abundance for some, and starvation for others. An era where entire forests are devoured for profit, where rivers run dry beneath cities glowing with excess, where the market celebrates those who consume the most, no matter the cost. We do not need to believe in spirits to see the Wendigo. We are living it. Psychologists have seen this too. Some describe the Wendigo as a symbol of psychological imbalance, of greed, grown so large it consumes the self. In this view, the creature is a metaphor for addiction, for consumerism, for unchecked desire. And this desire is not random. It is cultivated. We are told we are not enough, not beautiful enough, not wealthy enough, not safe enough, not powerful enough. And so we reach, we buy, we eat, we scroll, we hoard. But we are never full. The Wendigo is the hunger that does not end. The hunger that grows stronger the more it feeds. Sound familiar? It should. Because modern society is designed for appetite, not satisfaction. Capitalism in its most ravenous form depends on it. You must want, you must need, you must fear missing out. And slowly, you forget the line. You forget how much is enough. You forget what is sacred. The Wendigo then becomes a mirror. It asks, what are you feeding? And what is feeding on you? There's a reason the Wendigo grows taller with every victim. A reason it becomes thinner, hungrier, even as it eats. It is not just a creature, it is a cycle, a process. The more it devours, the more it becomes devouring. And so do we. When we consume without thought, when we extract without balance, when we value profit over life competition, over kinship, speed, over stillness, we become hollow. And in that hollowness, the Wendigo waits. But this metaphor runs deeper still. In dreams and psychology, the Wendigo can represent the shadow self, the repressed part of the psyche that lashes out when ignored. It is the shame we hide, the rage we suppress, the wounds we refuse to acknowledge. The more we ignore the wound, the more the Wendigo grows. In this way, the Wendigo is also trauma. Unprocessed grief, generational suffering, colonial violence made internal. Some indigenous psychologists have spoken of Wendigo stories as a way to process communal trauma, not through repression, but through ritual, storytelling, and healing. Because the cure for the Wendigo is not killing it. It is recognition. It is remembering the bonds that make us human. It is choosing to share when we want to hoard, to stay when we want to isolate, to give when we are afraid of scarcity. The Wendigo is not just a monster. It is a question, who are you when the winter comes? And winter, in many ways, is already here. Climate collapse, social fragmentation, loneliness as epidemic. These are not symptoms of bad luck. They are symptoms of imbalance, of forgetting the teachings that the Wendigo was designed to protect. Teachings about community, about restraint, about reciprocity with the land, about the truth that survival without soul is not survival, it is desecration. The Wendigo myth teaches us that endless hunger is not power. It is a curse. And this curse is not just ancient, it is now. We build technologies to connect us and feel more alone than ever. We create economies of scale and leave millions without shelter. We chase productivity and forget how to rest. We consume and consume and consume, and still we are hungry. That is the Wendigo's final lesson. It does not arrive when you are starving. It arrives when you have forgotten how to be full. In the next part, we will return to the land itself, to the forest, rivers, and snow, where the Wendigo was born. We will explore how indigenous teachings about balance and ecology offer not just myth, but medicine. But for now, pause, look inward, and ask yourself, what am I feeding? And what in turn is feeding on me? The Wendigo is a spirit of hunger, but it is also a spirit of land. It is born not just from famine, but from imbalance, from the severing of the sacred bond between human and earth. And to understand the Wendigo fully, we must return to where it lives, the forest, the snow, the wind. Because in the teachings of the first peoples, the world is alive, not metaphorically, literally. Rivers have memory, mountains have presence, trees have wisdom. Animals speak if you know how to listen. This is not a fantasy worldview. It is a worldview of relationship. In Algonquian cosmology, the land is not a resource. It is a relative, a living being with whom you are in sacred contract. You take only what you need. You offer thanks. You return what you can. The Wendigo breaks this contract. It takes without asking, consumes without limit, and in doing so, it disrupts the spirit web that holds the world together. This is why the Wendigo appears in winter when the land sleeps, when survival becomes desperate, and when the temptation to take more than you need grows loudest. The snow is not just weather, it is test. And the Wendigo is what happens when the test is failed. But the test is no longer seasonal. Now it is systemic. We live in a world where extraction is the rule. Trees are felled not for firewood, but for furniture. Rivers are redirected not for survival, but for profit. The land is carved, drilled, sold its bones, offered up for consumption. And the Wendigo grows, not just as symbol. As consequence, in the old stories, the Wendigo came when the land was dishonored, when game was hunted to extinction, when rituals were skipped, when greed outweighed gratitude. Now, we witness the same on a planetary scale. Entire ecosystems collapsing, species vanishing, waters poisoned, skies choked. And behind it all, a whisper. More, more, more. This is the voice of the Wendigo. Not in fur and fang, but in policy and profit. In the endless growth model. In the quarterly earnings, in the burning of one forest to grow food for another. It wears a suit now, or a brand, or a billboard. But the hunger is the same. Indigenous knowledge has always warned of this. Long before climate science, there were stories. Stories of sacred limits, of reciprocity, of what happens when humans forget they are not the only beings that matter. The Wendigo is not punishment from outside. It is consequence from within. A rupture in the cycle of respect. And the cure. It is not technology. It is not carbon credits. It is not more efficient consumption. It is remembering the relationship. It is looking at a tree and seeing a sibling, at a river and hearing an ancestor, at the land and feeling the pulse of your own heartbeat in its soil. This is what the Wendigo myth teaches us if we listen. That survival is not conquest. It is connection. That the forest is not wild. It is wounded. And that the creature we fear may only be the shadow cast by our own forgetting. But healing is possible. In many indigenous traditions, there are ceremonies for reconciliation with the land. Prayers offered to trees before cutting. Tobacco scattered on the earth in gratitude. Songs sung to animals before the hunt. These are not superstitions. They are systems of respect, ways of keeping the Wendigo at bay not through fear, but through care. The land responds to how it is treated. And when it is honored, the balance returns. Even today, some indigenous nations are reviving these teachings, integrating them into conservation work education and ecological protection. They speak not only of sustainability, but of sacredness. Because the land is not just something to protect. It is someone to protect. And in protecting it, we protect ourselves. The Wendigo is not inevitable. It is a warning, a sign that something has gone too far, that we have taken too much, forgotten too deeply, extracted without ceremony. But the story is not finished. We can still change it. We can return to relationship. We can listen to the wind not as threat but as voice. We can learn from the people who never forgot. In the next part, we will enter those voices, examining how indigenous leaders, artists, and spiritual teachers are reclaiming the Wendigo story, restoring its sacred context, and offering it not as horror, but as healing. But for now, close your eyes, listen to the forest, and ask not what the Wendigo is, but what the land is asking of you. For centuries, the Wendigo has been misunderstood, reshaped, distorted, exported. But now the story is coming home. Across Turtle Island, what many indigenous peoples call North America, there is a rising movement to reclaim the sacred, to retell the stories, and to restore what colonization tried to erase. The Wendigo is part of that reclamation. It begins with artists. Contemporary indigenous painters, dancers, and writers are reimagining the Wendigo not as horror, but as healing. Their works do not glorify the beast. They reveal the pain beneath it, the hunger that colonization planted, the fractures it left in community. One painting shows a Wendigo dissolving into smoke as an elder sings. Another shows a child looking into a mirror and seeing not a monster, but their future self resisting consumption. These are not just artistic statements, they are acts of spiritual resistance. Because reclaiming the Wendigo means reclaiming the right to define fear. To say this is what haunts us, and this is how we fight back. It also happens in classrooms. More and more indigenous educators are teaching the real story. They show students how the Wendigo was a moral compass, a cultural boundary, a spiritual teacher, not just a beast in the woods. They teach it not through textbooks, but through relationship. They ask, what does hunger mean to you? What does enough look like? How do you know when you've crossed the line? These questions bring the myth alive, not as ancient artifact, but as living guide. And then there are the storytellers, the elders. In longhouses and lodges and community centers and firesides, they speak the names again. They tell the stories that were once forbidden. They do not rush. They do not flatten. They let silence speak when needed. An elder begins. There was once a man who took more than he needed. And the children lean in, because they know this is not just history. It is a map. And perhaps the most powerful reclamation is in ceremony. In ritual spaces where the Wendigo is not feared, but honored as a warning, yes, but also as a teacher. Herbs are burned, songs sung, offerings made to the land, to the ancestors, to the stories themselves. Because in Indigenous cosmology, stories are alive, and when they are harmed, they must be healed. The Wendigo, after centuries of distortion, is being rebalanced. Its image is being pulled away from Hollywood and placed back in the circle, where it belongs, where it can teach again, not as spectacle, but as symbol. A symbol of colonial hunger, of internalized fear, of broken relationships with land and kin, but also of resilience, because the Wendigo story has survived. Despite bans, despite mockery, despite commercialization, it has endured, and now it is being wielded with purpose. Indigenous climate activists invoke the Wendigo when speaking of pipeline greed and deforestation. The Wendigo is back, one speaker said, and it wears a logo. They are not joking. They are warning. Just as their ancestors once did. Writers are penning novels where the Wendigo is not a villain but a consequence. A reflection of what happens when community fails and silence grows too thick. These works are not just horror. They are ceremony on the page. Podcasts, short films, and comics by Indigenous creators are challenging the stereotype. They are asking the audience, why are you afraid of the Wendigo? Is it because it's monstrous, or because it reflects you? The mirror is being held up again, but this time it is in the hands of those who carried it first. This reclamation is not easy. It takes courage to speak what was silenced, to untangle the knots of centuries, to say this story is not yours to twist. And yet they do it, with clarity, with compassion, with fire. Because storytelling is not entertainment. It is medicine. And medicine, like the land, must be protected. What we are witnessing is not just cultural revival. It is spiritual repair. And the Wendigo, once stripped of its meaning, is once again becoming what it always was, a spirit of warning, a guardian of balance, a force that demands we look inward before we destroy outward. In the next part, we will explore the crossroads, how modern society, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can respond to the Wendigo myth as a call to change. A blueprint, not just for fear, but for transformation. But for now, hear this. The Wendigo is not coming back. It never left. It waited quietly, patiently, until the right voices were ready. And now those voices are speaking. We stand at a threshold, a moment of choice where the stories we carry determine the futures we create. The Wendigo has walked beside us for centuries, as warning, as mirror, as shadow. But what if it could also be a guide? Not to fear, but to transformation. Because every story, even the darkest, carries a seed of healing. And the Wendigo is no exception. Its tale is not just about hunger, it is about what happens when hunger goes unchecked. And in that space, we are invited to ask, what now? What do we do with this myth? What do we do with ourselves? The answers begin with seeing clearly. We live in a culture of appetite, of speed, of ownership. Our economies thrive on the illusion of lack, that you are never enough, never have enough, never give enough. So you buy and scroll and accumulate. And all the while, something inside you says, this isn't it. The Wendigo knows this voice. It is the whisper before the scream, the quiet knowing before collapse, the chill before the storm. But it is not too late, because to see the Wendigo is not to surrender to it. It is to remember that you have a choice. To consume or to connect, to compete or to care, to keep running or to stop, breathe, and ask, what kind of ancestor will I be? This is where the Wendigo myth becomes medicine, because it teaches boundaries. It teaches accountability. It teaches what happens when we forget we belong to each other and to the earth. Modern society is beginning to remember movements for degrowth, for sustainability, for minimalism. They echo ancient teachings. Teachings that Indigenous communities never forgot. Teachings that say enough is a sacred word, and gratitude is a form of wealth. When you live in reciprocity, the Wendigo cannot take root, because you are not feeding it. You are feeding life. This is not about going backward. It is about going deeper, into the stories that have always known what we are just now beginning to understand, that real power is restraint. That real freedom is relationship. That real survival is not domination, but balance. Communities around the world are rising, rewilding forests, restoring rivers, reviving languages, retelling stories. Each act a rebellion against the Wendigo world. Each gesture a reminder we do not have to live like this. And still the hunger returns. Because systems do not change overnight. Because addiction to excess is hard to break. Because the Wendigo once fed is difficult to starve. But not impossible. We begin by naming it. In ourselves, in our structures, in our silences. And then we make new choices. We listen to those who remember older ways. We slow down. We give thanks. We take only what we need. And when we take too much, we make amends. The Wendigo myth offers no illusions. It does not promise easy redemption. It shows us what happens when we lose our way, and what it takes to return. That return is not heroic. It is humble. It begins in kitchens where families choose local food over imported excess. In classrooms where children learn the story of the Wendigo, not to fear, but to reflect. In boardrooms where someone finally says, "How much profit is enough?" In bedrooms where someone puts down the phone, closes their eyes, and listens for silence. That silence is not empty. It is sacred. It is the space where the Wendigo cannot enter. Because in that space we remember, we are not alone. We are not endless. We are not what we consume. We are what we care for. And what cares for us? The earth does not ask for perfection. Only presence. Only partnership. Only the willingness to listen before taking. To pause before reaching. To breathe before devouring. The Wendigo is not just a creature. It is a crossroad. And here we are, feet planted, breath fogging in the air, eyes wide open. In the next part, we will walk into that final truth, what it means to live in a post-Wendigo world. To imagine a future where balance is restored, where story is honored, where hunger bows before harmony. But for now, ask yourself, what am I choosing today? And what am I feeding with that choice? What if the Wendigo was never meant to be slain, but understood? What if its tale told fully becomes not just a warning, but a compass? Imagine a world that takes the Wendigo seriously. A world that remembers the old teachings not as relics, but as foundations. In this world, we do not run from hunger. We recognize it. We name its sources emotional, material, spiritual, and we meet them with care, not consumption. Children learn the Wendigo story not through screams, but through silence. In classrooms warmed by shared meals and slow storytelling, they are taught that enough is a sacred word, that to take more than needed is to forget who you are, that the earth speaks and you must listen. Economies shift, not to stagnation but to rhythm. Harvests are measured not just in yield, but in regeneration. Success is not profit but balance. Leaders are chosen for humility, not charisma. Growth is circular, not endless. Communities deepen. Food is grown in common gardens. Elders are not isolated, they are sought. Songs return to the rivers, ceremonies to the hills. The lines between sacred and ordinary blur because all life is kin. The Wendigo is still spoken of, but differently. It is not a beast in the woods. It is the ache in your chest when you betray yourself. The shadow on your wall when you take too much. The silence between people when they forget how to be human. In this new world, the Wendigo is not erased. It is integrated, held, thanked. Because even monsters can become teachers when we are willing to learn. This world is not perfect. There are still winters, still losses, still moments when the old hunger returns. But there are practices now, songs, circles, reminders. People pause before taking, reflect before deciding, speak before consuming. And in that pause, the Wendigo fades. Not with violence, with reverence. This is not fantasy. It is memory rediscovered. It is vision rooted in the old stories. Across the world, fragments of this future already exist. In indigenous communities, reviving ancestral governance. In urban gardens, sprouting between buildings. In mutual aid networks that value people over systems. In art that remembers what was lost and dares to imagine what could be again. These are the seedlings of a post-Wendigo world. A world not without hunger, but one that feeds it wisely. Feeds it with music, with meaning, with kinship, with limits. Because a culture that knows how to say no more is not weak. It is wise. And wisdom is what the Wendigo has always offered if you're brave enough to hear it. Brave enough to sit by the fire and let the story work on you, to let it settle into your bones, to ask not how to escape the monster, but how to make peace with the hunger. This future is not a dream. It is a choice, one we can make daily, in what we eat, in how we build, in who we listen to, and when we say enough. The Wendigo, when understood, becomes a sacred threshold, not between man and beast, but between who we have been and who we might still become. In the final part, we will return to the source, the fire, the forest, the first story, and we will ask with new eyes, what has the Wendigo truly come to teach? But for now, take a breath, look at your hands, and remember, they were made not just to hold, but to heal. The story ends where it began, by the fire, in the forest, with silence thick between the trees. You sit across from the elder, the one who began this journey. Their voice was rough, then sharp with warning. Now it is soft, not weaker, wiser. The flames dance, and the story breathes. The Wendigo is not evil, the elder says. It is misunderstood. A pause. You feared it because you saw it in others, but it lives where we forget our place. Another pause. Now you've remembered. You watch the sparks rise into the dark. Something inside you quiets, not out of fear, but reverence. Because what the Wendigo offered was never just horror. It was truth, a reflection of what we become when we abandon relationship, a shadow of our potential untethered from care, a consequence born from forgetting we are not alone. And in that forgetting, the Wendigo was born. But it does not have to stay. The elder leans forward. Every story ends in choice. You understand. You can carry this story as myth, or as mirror, as something distant or something intimate. Because in the end, the Wendigo is not a creature. It is a question. Who will you be when the hunger calls? Will you reach for more or reach for others? Will you consume or connect? Will you survive alone or live together? This is what the story was always asking. Not what is the Wendigo, but what are you becoming? The flames crackle, and in their light you see the ark, a story born of snow and silence, twisted by fear, revived by truth, and returned now to its roots. You see the people who carried it, the elders silenced, the storytellers mocked, the teachings buried, but also the revival, the reclamation, the resilience. You see the artists reshaping the myth, the children relearning the lesson, the forests whispering their forgiveness. You see a world turning, slowly, carefully, back toward balance. Because balance is not perfection. It is remembering. Remembering that enough is sacred, that hunger has a place, but not the throne, that monsters lose power when they are seen. The Wendigo was never meant to be destroyed, only acknowledged, held, honored, so it can return to what it once was, a guardian, a boundary, a fire at the edge of the woods saying go no further. And if we listen, truly listen, then perhaps the Wendigo will rest. Not in defeat, in peace. You rise. The fire still burns, but you no longer need it to see. The forest around you is not haunted, it is alive. And you are not alone. The story has changed you. You will carry it now, not in fear, in responsibility. You walk back toward the world, not to escape the Wendigo, but to meet it when it arises, in policy, in profit, in impulse, in yourself. And when it does, you will not run. You will stand. You will remember the elder's words. You will remember the forest's breath. You will remember that stories live not in books, but in choices. Yours. And as you walk, the voice returns no longer monstrous, but familiar. It says, I am the hunger you must name. I am the shadow you must face. I am the fire you must tend. I'm not here to consume you. I am here to remind you who you are. The Wendigo fades. The silence deepens. And somewhere far behind you, in the snow and wind and ancient root, a new voice begins. A child's voice, repeating the story you now know by heart. And so it continues, not to scare, to awaken. Because in the end, the Wendigo did not come to devour you. It came to return you to yourself.